Lord, have mercy on my soul. Sweet Jesus, receive me.
They said her scream never came, that in the cold gray light of February, she stepped onto the scaffold at Tower Green, with the silence of someone already gone. They said she rehearsed it, the way her neck would meet the block, placing her head over and over again the night before, as if choreography could dull the sting of the axe. Her name was Katherine Howard, fifth wife of King Henry VIII. And before she turned 20, she was dead. But that wasn't the end of her story. In fact, it was the beginning of the most unsettling part, the part where even her bones were not allowed to remain. Because unlike the other queens Henry executed, Catherine's body vanished. Not into legend, not into marble tombs or sealed crypts, but into quicklime, soil, and silence. She was not just killed, she was erased. The tale begins as so many Tudor tragedies do, with a marriage not born of love, but power. In the summer of the year 1540, the aging and ailing Henry, bloated and bitter, cast aside his fourth wife Anne of Cleves and took the young, vibrant Catherine as his bride. She was somewhere between 15 and 17 years old. While the king was nearing 50, his leg was ulcered and stinking, his moods were violent and unpredictable. But Catherine had youth, beauty, laughter, and the misfortune of belonging to the Howard family, an ambitious, noble house determined to return to the favor once held by the Boleyns. It was her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, who placed her at court. It was he who watched her catch the king's eye, and it was he who watched her ascend to the throne without ever truly becoming queen. For she was never crowned. She played her part. She smiled, wore gowns stitched with pearls, received estates and titles, and sat beside the king in pageants as the very picture of obedience and charm. But Catherine was a child, naive and unprepared for the brutal codes of royal survival. In her world, flirtation was treason, letters were weapons, and a single secret could bring down a dynasty. The moment the rumors began of her past with Francis Dereham, of her late-night meetings with Thomas Culpeper, of the love letter they found hidden in a lady's belongings, it was only a matter of time. In the chapel at Hampton Court, while the king prayed, his counsel whispered the truth into his ear, and the floor beneath Catherine's feet vanished. She was locked in her rooms, clawing at the walls, sobbing in despair so deep that witnesses claimed it would break the heart of any man to see it. They feared she would end her life before the king could, but death in Tudor England came in stages: first disgrace, then detainment, then attainder. Parliament passed the act without trial. She was never given the chance to speak in her defense. Her marriage was never annulled. Her love letters never burned. And her guilt was never proven because it did not have to be. By law, she was guilty the moment the king felt betrayed. By the time she was taken to the Tower, the game was over. The heads of her former lovers, Culpeper and Dereham, were already rotting on pikes above London Bridge. A warning to all who might think themselves above the king's pride. When she passed beneath them, some said she wept. Others said she broke, but it no longer mattered. On the 12th of February, in the year 1542, she spent the night alone with her thoughts and the wooden block that would become her pillow. And at dawn, when the guards came to take her, she did not struggle. She walked barefoot across the green, her hair loose, her lips whispering prayers no one would ever write down. And when the executioner raised his axe, she did not flinch. It was a clean blow. One strike. The head fell. And with it, the queen that never truly was. Her blood soaked the straw. Her body, wrapped in a thin cloth, was carried into the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where Anne Boleyn had also been laid. But unlike Anne, Catherine would not rest in peace. There was no coffin, no inscription, no solemn procession. Instead, there was quicklime caustic. Hungry, merciless, was poured over her corpse at the king's command. Its purpose was simple: to erase. It was used for plague victims, traitors, and those whose memory was meant to be wiped clean from the earth. Henry did not want a grave that pilgrims might visit, nor a body that future kings might honor. He wanted her gone, dissolved, and so she was. Century passed. In the reign of Queen Victoria, restoration work began on the Tower Chapel. Bones were unearthed, catalogued, studied. Anne Boleyn's were found, matched to the wounds of a sword. Jane Boleyn's were found too, buried after Catherine. But when they searched for the fifth wife, there was nothing. No ribs, no skull, no trace of a young woman violently taken. The archaeologists were baffled. The records were clear. She had died there. She had been buried there. But she was gone. Some say her youth was her final curse, that her bones were too soft, her body too unformed, and the quicklime too efficient. Others whisper that the burial was never properly done, that the men who tossed her into the pit feared her ghost more than they feared the king. But whatever the reason, it worked. Henry VIII succeeded. Katherine Howard did not leave behind a body. Only a name. Only a whisper in the stones. And yet, 500 years later, her absence speaks louder than her life ever did. In the chapel where she once lay, beneath the cold stones and flickering candles, there is a plaque with her name carved gently into it. A memorial to nothing. A placeholder for a soul no longer tethered to this world. She is the queen without a tomb. The girl without a grave. The wife who was loved for a moment, and then obliterated by the man who could not bear to remember her. And that is how it began, not with a kiss or a crown, but with an axe, a handful of lime, and a silence that still lingers in the tower today. Before she was a queen, before the silk gowns and the axe, Katherine Howard was a girl almost no one wanted. She was born into privilege but not protection, into a name of weight but not warmth. Her mother died when she was still small, so young, in fact, that most records don't bother to name the age, only that she was left behind. Her father, Lord Edmund Howard, was a failure of a man. The kind of father whose greatest gift to his children was absence. He squandered opportunities. Debts followed him like shadows. And whatever affections he might have had for his daughter vanished beneath the pressure of poverty and disappointment. Catherine was sent away not to a loving aunt or a careful tutor, but to a strange halfway world between education and abandonment, a crumbling household that masqueraded as noble upbringing. The place was the household of Agnes Tilney, Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, a formidable woman, too busy with court politics and managing the vast Howard family to pay much attention to the gaggle of young wards and distant relations dumped into her care. They were not children so much as future pawns, and their upbringing was haphazard at best. The house in Lambeth was not a school, not a palace, not even a proper home. It was more like a cracked and crooked greenhouse, where young girls were left to grow wild beneath the weight of ancient portraits and wandering male eyes. There were no strict lessons, no governess watching with holy discipline, no chapel hours to guide their souls. Instead, the days passed with music, Laughter, whispered stories, stolen food, and the ever-present sense that the walls had ears and the servants had opinions. Girls slept in shared dormitories, giggled late into the night, and traded ribbons and secrets. It might have seemed charming, even harmless, to an outsider. But for a girl like Katherine, young, bright-eyed, and starved for affection, it was a dangerous education. There were men in the house, tutors, stewards, visitors, and none of them were saints. It was in this setting that Katherine met Henry VIII, one of her earliest entanglements. A man many believe used his position as music teacher to press himself upon the vulnerable girl. She was still a child when he kissed her. Still a child when he slid his hand beneath her gown. Still a child when he promised affection, though it came laced with shame. The nature of their relationship is murky, part romance, part coercion, but fully inappropriate. What mattered, though, was that Katherine learned her first lesson in love there, that desire was confusing, that men took what they wanted, and that girls who said yes could later be punished as if they'd said no. After Minox, there was Francis Derham. He was older, more possessive, and far more dangerous. With him, Katherine shared more than flirtation. There were letters, gifts, and perhaps even promises of marriage. Derham, unlike Manox, saw her as something to claim. He boasted of their closeness. He called her his wife. Whether Katherine truly believed herself betrothed or merely caught in his web, no one can say. But their time together left behind words on parchment, proof that, to some, she was already ruined long before she ever saw the king. And the watching eyes kept watching. The servants gossiped. The other girls whispered. But no one stepped in. No one protected her. No one pulled her aside to say, this is not love. This is not safety. This is not your fault. In Tudor England, the shame always fell on the girl, and the shame never went away. It simply followed quietly, like a shadow stitched into her hemline, waiting to be exposed at the worst possible moment. Still, Katherine survived that chapter. She was not broken by it. She grew into her beauty like a garden recovering after frost, bright, delicate, and unaware of how close winter still lurked. Her laughter returned. Her songs echoed through the halls. And soon, word of her charm began to spread beyond Lambeth. At court, her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, took notice. The Howards were a proud and hungry family, and they saw in Katherine a chance to rise again. Her cousin, Anne Boleyn, had once worn a crown. Why not Katherine? So she was brought to court, placed into the household of the current queen, Anne of Cleves. A political bride, the king found dull and repulsive. Katherine's role was modest. She served. She smiled. She watched. But that was all Henry needed. He noticed her, as he always did with younger women. And this time, the girl noticed him back. Imagine it. A king, massive and swollen from disease, limping from room to room with a leg that never stopped bleeding. A man once handsome, now monstrous in flesh and pride. And then Katherine, 17, maybe, dressed in silks but still soft with youth. Yet still unsure of how to carry a gaze or bend her voice like a weapon. She did not flirt. Not at first. She blushed. She trembled. She offered what she thought he wanted: obedience, admiration, the illusion that she adored him. And he believed it. The court turned its gaze toward her. The queen noticed. The ladies whispered. But no one dared stop the king when he began to call her his rose without a thorn. It was a phrase he had used once before on Anne Boleyn. Before her head landed in a Frenchman's hands, history was preparing to repeat itself. And Catherine, though surrounded by silk and power, had no one to warn her. It would be easy, now, to judge her, to call her foolish, to call her ambitious, to say she should have known better, but she was still, in many ways, the girl from Lambeth, from the crowded dormitory and the house without rules, still a girl without a mother, still looking for affection in the eyes of men who never truly saw her. By the time she stood at the altar beside the king in the summer of 1540, it was already too late. The castle was still full of eyes. The servants still whispered. But now, any mistake would no longer be gossip. It would be treason. And Catherine, despite the jewels and titles, had not yet learned how sharp a crown could be. She did not know that the letters she had written before would resurface like ghosts, that the men from her past would become weapons in the hands of her enemies, that the love she would later find real or imagined with Thomas Culpeper would lead her to the block. She was still dancing through the palace, laughing at court jesters, smiling at the king's pain-ridden jokes. But outside the velvet chambers and candlelit halls, the storm was already gathering, and all the while, the castle kept watching. By the summer of the year 1540, the court had already learned to walk softly around their king. He was no longer the golden boy who had once jousted in the tilt-yard or danced until dawn with foreign princesses. He was a man swollen by pride, swollen by pain, and swollen by power that no longer needed to shout to be heard. His leg, ulcered and foul-smelling, throbbed with each step, a constant reminder of the jousting accident that had transformed a prince into a tyrant beneath the silks and the ermine. His flesh wept with infection. Servants fainted when forced to clean the wound. Physicians whispered of gangrene. And yet, despite the rot, despite the grotesque body that dragged itself from throne to chapel, Henry VIII still believed himself a lover, still believed he deserved beauty, still believed he could be adored. It was not love he wanted. Love was for poets and fools. What the king wanted was devotion, unquestioning, absolute, glittering in the eyes of a girl too young to remember what he had done to the last woman who disappointed him. Anne Boleyn had died by sword. Jane Seymour had died giving him a son. Anne of Cleves had been set aside like a meal grown cold. But Katherine Howard, she smiled. She laughed. She smelled of rosewater and new silk. She curtsied with grace that did not yet know fear, and she came from a family that understood exactly how to deliver what the king desired. Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, had learned the lessons of ambition carved in blood. He had watched his niece, Anne Boleyn, rise like a star and fall like a stone. He had seen what the king could give and what he could take away. So when his young relative, Catherine, caught the eye of the sovereign, he did not tremble. He acted to the Howards. She was not just a girl. She was a gift, a strategy, a second chance, a way to claw their way back into the center of the storm. And Henry, lost in his need to be worshipped again, accepted her as such. The marriage came quickly, though it was shrouded in silences. Anne of Cleves was pushed aside under the pretext of a lack of attraction. But everyone at court knew the truth. The king had found something more pleasing. He spoke of Catherine as if she were heaven, sent his jewel, his dove, his salvation. He called her his rose without a thorn. Never mind that he had once said the same thing about the woman whose ghost still walked the tower. He showered Catherine with jewels, estates, gowns threaded with gold, and the kind of attention that could suffocate even the strongest heart. To the world, he presented a portrait of joy renewed, but to those within the court's trembling inner circle, the truth was more complex. Henry's affections were tidal. They surged. They withdrew. And they crashed against anyone who dared to resist. One moment, he was warm. The next, volcanic. His body betrayed him daily. He could barely walk, let alone dance. His mood turned with the wind, and the rage that lived just beneath his skin often erupted without warning. But Katherine, at least for a time, seemed to soothe him. She was light where he was heavy, laughter where he was thunder. She flattered him, and for that, he called her wise. She kissed his hand, and for that, he called her loyal. She smiled through her fear, and for that, he believed she loved him. But Katherine Howard had not been raised to navigate the treacherous waters of kingship. She was not like Catherine of Aragon, with her iron sense of righteousness. She was not like Anne Boleyn, with her sharp tongue and cunning mind, nor like Jane Seymour, who had mastered the art of quiet compliance. Catherine was still a girl. She had known men before the king's secret. Stolen kisses in the corners of the Lambeth household. Hands beneath sheets in rooms without guards. She had written love letters not meant to be burned. She had whispered promises into the wrong ears. And she had not yet learned that a queen's past is never truly past. It only waits. The wedding was private. There was no coronation. No golden crown pressed upon her head before the eyes of God and nobles. But there were banquets, and music, and the king's grin wide and possessive as he displayed her like a jewel newly acquired. She played her role, wore her titles like perfume, and took her place beside a man nearly 3 decades, her senior. The court watched with wary eyes. Some pitied her, some envied her, but all of them knew what could come next. Even as Catherine settled into her role, there were those who remembered her time in the Duchess of Norfolk's household. Servants whispered. Old letters resurfaced. Francis Derham reappeared, demanding favor, boasting of past intimacies. And Thomas Culpeper, the king's own groom of the stool, the man trusted to help the monarch dress and undress, lingered near her too often, too closely. There were rumors of late-night meetings, of letters passed in secret, of a queen playing with fire. Not understanding, she stood already in the center of the blaze. Yet for a time, Henry was blind, or chose to be. He paraded Catherine across the kingdom during their summer progress. They visited castles and cathedrals, accepted the cheers of townsfolk, posed for portraits meant to immortalize a happiness already fraying at the edges. He called her his pearl, his redemption, but even then, the pain in his leg festered. The weight of age and betrayal burned like coals beneath his skin, and the shadows at court grew longer. Behind Catherine's laughter, fear began to grow. She knew what had happened to Anne Boleyn. She had heard the stories, perhaps from her own family, the accusations, the false witnesses, the sudden arrests, the sword that sliced through love as cleanly as through bone. She had stepped into a palace, but now she walked through a maze of ghosts. And still, she was watched by maids who remembered too much, by men who owed the king their loyalty, by the queen's own ladies in waiting, some of whom had loyalties far more dangerous than friendship. Each step she took, each glance she offered, each breath she exhaled, it all became part of a ledger she would never be allowed to read. Katherine Howard had been given to the king as a gift, but now, That gift was beginning to rot in his hands. And Henry, who could not tolerate the smell of disloyalty, he was preparing to open the box and see what secrets lay inside. The court no longer whispered. It watched in silence. The girl who once danced in shared dormitories, who once laughed in moonlight with music tutors and scribbled love notes with untrained hands, was now a queen who sat beside a man rotting from the inside out. And neither of them knew that her head would fall before the next spring. There are things that should never be written. Words meant for one pair of eyes only. Phrases meant to live in the heat of breath. Not the cold permanence of ink. But Katherine Howard, young as she was, still believed in the magic of letters. She believed that words could bind two hearts more tightly than gold rings or royal decrees. And so, one day, while dressed in silks gifted by a king she did not love, she dipped her pen into ink and wrote to a man who was not her husband, Thomas Culpeper. His name was written carefully, as if the shape of it might betray her. Her hand was steady. Her heart was not. Some say it was love. Others say it was longing. Or perhaps just the reckless desperation of a girl who had everything but the one thing she truly wanted. Whatever it was, that letter became the beginning of the end, not because it was read, but because it was kept. And someone always keeps the wrong letter. By then, whispers had begun to take shape. Katherine was queen. Yes, but queens are watched more closely than any woman alive. At court, eyes lined every corridor. Every tapestry hid a mouth. And silence was rarely silence at all. Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, had been there once before, had helped her sister-in-law Anne arrange meetings that ended in blood. Now, she was the one smoothing Katherine's sleeves, arranging private moments, and keeping the watch outside the wrong door at the wrong hour. And Katherine, either naive or aching, met with Culpeper. It was not often. Perhaps only once. Perhaps more. No one can say for certain what passed between them. Some claimed they merely spoke. Others claimed they kissed. A few insisted it went further. But in the end, none of it mattered more than that single, damning letter, the one with Katherine's name at the bottom, and the wrong kind of affection folded inside. She had written, "It makes my heart die to think I cannot be always in your company." She had written, "Yours, as long as life endures." The kind of words that make the axe fall faster. The hands that carried the letter did not know they were holding a death sentence. It passed from chamber to chamber, cloak to cloak, until one day, it was no longer hidden, no longer a secret. The wrong eyes saw it. The wrong heart heard the name Culpeper and remembered too well the last queen who loved another. And so, with terrible calm, the machinery of accusation began to turn. Archbishop Cranmer was the first to speak the truth aloud. He approached the king slowly, nervously, while Henry knelt in prayer inside the chapel at Hampton Court. The air was heavy with incense. The candles flickered, and Cranmer whispered in the king's ear that his young wife had been unfaithful, had betrayed him, had taken another man into her heart, or into her bed. It was not clear yet. It didn't need to be. Henry's face did not change at first. Then it cracked. Some said he roared. Others said he wept. Still others said he said nothing at all. But when he stood, he did not go to her. He did not ask for explanation. He simply gave the order, lock her doors, seal her in, keep her alone. Katherine was confined to her chambers. No warning, no goodbye, no answer to the frantic knocking she made when the guards refused to open the door. She beat her fists against the walls until they bruised. She called for the king. again and again. But the king did not come. He had gone to hide in his grief, or his shame, or perhaps simply to plan how to erase her. She was found pacing, weeping, at times calm, at times curled like a child beneath the tapestries. She asked the maids if they believed she would die. She asked if the king still loved her, but they were not allowed to answer. They brought food and left. They changed the linens and looked away. Even Jane Boleyn was taken from her, dragged screaming into her own prison where she would be questioned for hours, her mind already beginning to bend under the weight of fear. And the letter, the one that should have burned, was now being passed from hand to hand, once more this time, by men who wore robes of state, not cloaks of lovers. They read it aloud in chambers. They studied the loops of Catherine's script, as if the words themselves could betray new meaning, and with each rereading, her fate sharpened. Soon, arrests began. Culpeper was taken first, then Darium, then Jane, then anyone who had ever carried a whisper of her past. Confession came quickly, under threat, under pressure, under torture. Darium spoke of his past with Catherine, of how they had once planned to marry. Culpeper spoke of meetings, of opportunity, of desire. And Catherine had no voice in any of it. Eventually, she was brought from her chambers under armed guard. The air outside had grown cold. Leaves fell in the palace gardens. The world moved forward. But Catherine did not. She was taken to Sion Abbey, far from the court, to await the king's judgment. She wrote no more letters. She received none. Her ladies reported that she wandered the halls in silence, then sobbed through the night. One said she whispered Culpeper's name in her sleep. Another said she whispered the king's. Both could be true. Neither mattered now. The king remained in his palace, refusing to see her, refusing to hear her plea. He told the council that he had been bewitched, that he had been made a fool, that his fifth wife had stained the sacred office of queen. But in private, some said, he asked where she was. Others said he refused to speak her name at all. Parliament passed the Bill of Attainder in the cold weeks of winter. It declared Catherine guilty without trial. It declared that she had betrayed the king, and that she would die for it. No jury, no defense, only a date, a time, and a place where the scaffold would be built. And all because of a letter written by a girl who wanted to be loved, a letter passed by hands that could not keep it hidden, a letter that should have burned, but it did not burn, and neither would the memory of her final walk. There are prisons made of stone, and there are prisons made of silence. Katherine Howard had known both. From the moment the doors shut behind her and the great bolts slid into place, she was no longer a queen. She was a girl in a room with no escape. No trial had yet been set. No sentence yet declared. But she could feel the weight of death already gathering beneath her ribs. It crept in with the cold. It soaked into the floors. It spoke through the eyes of the women who came and went with bowls of broth and folded linens, but would not speak her name. Sion Abbey was meant to be a place of contemplation. But for Catherine, it became a limbo where time unraveled. The days blurred. The nights stretched without end. She wandered the stone halls like a ghost in training. Her thoughts snagging on memories she could no longer reach, hands once held in secret. Laughter that once echoed in warm chambers. The smell of polished wood. The thrill of music played in the dark. The flash of Culpeper's smile, and beneath it all, a rising dread, not of death itself, but of the silence that would come before it. The slow forgetting, the erasure, the realization that no one would come, She asked, again and again, to see the king. Sometimes she whispered it. Sometimes she shouted. Sometimes she pressed her face against the cold wood of the doors until her skin turned red and raw. But no message came. No token. No letter with trembling signature and wax seal. Not even a guard sent to lie with soft words. The king, who had once called her his rose without a thorn, who had kissed her fingers and filled her lap with jewels, now sent nothing at all. The silence was worse than fury. At least rage meant she still existed in his mind. But this absence was a kind of death before the real one. She was fading by degrees. Not from the world, but from the memory of the man who had once claimed to love her. She began to speak aloud, not to the women around her, but to herself, to the walls, to the memory of him. Sometimes she defended herself to no one. Sometimes she recited prayers, half remembered from childhood. Sometimes she simply cried and waited for someone to ask why. No one did. Outside her cell, England moved on. Parliament met. The council convened, and far from the stone walls where she waited, the men in robes and furs discussed how best to cut her from history. The bill of attainder passed quickly. There was no need for trial. Her guilt had already been decided. Not by facts, but by fear. The king's pride had been wounded. And pride, when held by a man with absolute power and rotting flesh, was a dangerous thing. Still, Katherine hoped, even in the final week. As the sentence loomed, she whispered his name as though it were a prayer. She believed no. She needed to believe that if she could only see him, explain herself, fall at his feet and cry, he would forgive her. She was young. She had made mistakes. Hadn't he once done the same? Hadn't he once loved another while married? Hadn't he kissed in secret and sworn to the moon he would never let go? But Katherine had no Anne Boleyn's cunning, no Catherine of Aragon's nobility. She had no son, no strong allies, no crown truly placed on her head. She was a girl locked in a cold stone room with nothing but memories, and a single vision of an execution block that she could not stop replaying in her mind. And so, one night, she asked for it. The block, the same one used for other traitors. She asked that it be brought to her so she could practice. It was not a request made out of drama or defiance. It was not theatrical. It was survival. In the quiet of her final days, Katherine was trying to reclaim one thing: dignity. If she could not stop her death, she could at least choose how to meet it. If she had to die before dawn, then she would do it gracefully, without panic, without screaming, without flinching. She laid her head upon the wood. Once, twice, again, finding the angle, breathing through the fear, imagining the axe, the crowd, the moment before everything stopped. They say she did it for hours, practicing how not to die in disgrace, practicing how not to tremble. The block became her final companion. Elsewhere, her friends were breaking. Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, the one who had once stood guard while Katherine and Culpeper met in secret, had fallen into madness, whether from guilt and fear, or the unbearable pressure of being held responsible for yet another queen's death. She stopped making sense. She babbled. She screamed. She tore at her clothes and her hair. At first, it seemed she might be spared, for the law forbade the execution of the insane, but the king changed the law, had Parliament rewrite the words, so that madness would no longer save a woman from the axe. There would be no mercy for any of them. The night before her execution, Katherine did not sleep. The Tower was not kind to young women. and the walls there were thick with grief. Anne Boleyn had once walked the same steps. Lady Jane Grey had wept the same tears. And now Catherine, too, became part of the tower's long, quiet chorus of broken hearts. She dressed carefully that morning. Her hair was loose. Her gown was simple. Her face was pale, but calm. When they came for her, she did not resist. She walked with grace across the grass, past the old stones and the crows that gathered like sentinels. The wind was sharp, the sky gray. A few courtiers stood near the scaffold, their faces unreadable. The executioner waited with axe in hand. He had done this before, but not to someone so young, so still. She climbed the steps, courtsiet, spoke a few quiet words asking for prayers, and then she knelt. There are many versions of what she said. Some say she wished for mercy. Others say she called herself guilty. One version claims she said she would rather die the wife of Culpeper than the wife of a king. But the truth is quieter than legend. She laid her head upon the block and waited. The cry never came. No one shouted in protest. No one ran to stop it. No one, not even the wind, spoke up for her. The axe came down once, clean, merciful. If mercy could be found in such an end. And Katherine Howard, the queen who had written the wrong letter, kissed the wrong man, and trusted the wrong silence, became another ghost in the tower. The walls that had locked her in held her secrets tightly, and her final cry, soft as it may have been, vanished into stone. They said the executioner did not tremble, that his hands were steady, his blade swift, and that the axe struck Katherine Howard's neck in a single, perfect arc, the kind of stroke that could have been mercy, if mercy had ever touched her life. She had knelt so carefully, positioned her body just as she had practiced, her long hair tucked out of the way, her breath caught in her chest, her last prayer whispered not to God, but to silence. And when the blade fell, it was not with rage, nor with judgment, it was with a practiced finality. Like closing the last page of a book, no one dared to read again. The head rolled forward. The blood came fast. The straw turned dark. But the crowd did not cry out. They had seen queens die before. They had watched crowns fall from the heads of women still in their bloom. The Tudor court was not a place for the faint-hearted, and Catherine, poor child, had not died screaming. She had died quietly, elegantly, and that, perhaps, unsettled them more. The body was taken away almost at once, wrapped not in royal cloth, not in velvet or lined linen, but in a simple sheet, thin, stained, the same kind they used for common traitors and thieves. Her head was placed beside her, not cradled or honored, but set down like an object to be discarded. There were no mourners, no priests with solemn faces, no music, no bells, no gentle voices reciting scripture, only footsteps on stone, the murmurs of guards, and the closing of the chapel door. St. Peter, ad vincula, St. Peter in chains, was where they brought her. The same little chapel where Anne Boleyn had been laid, where Jane Boleyn, mad and ruined, would soon follow. The floor was packed earth and unmarked graves, the altar plain, the air cold. Here, queens were made equal with men who had died, screaming under torture. Here, the sins of the court were buried without names. But Catherine's burial was not just hidden. It was erased. There was no coffin, no marker, no carved stone to carry her name through the centuries. She was not buried with ceremony, but with lime, Quicklime, a substance meant to destroy, not to preserve, poured over her body at the king's command. It hissed into the flesh, soaked into the bones, and began the quiet, violent work of decomposition. A queen dissolved not by time, but by order. No one knows who carried out the command. Perhaps it was a nameless worker, told only that the king wished it so. Perhaps it was someone who had once bowed to her, once tied her gown, or fastened her pearls. Perhaps they did it with trembling hands. Perhaps they didn't care. But the quicklime was poured thick, enough to eat through a body in weeks, enough to ensure that no relic, no rib, no trace would remain. And over the years, the soil forgot the shape of her. There would be no relic to weep over, no fragment to enshrine, no skull to identify centuries later, no brittle bones to cradle in gloved hands. Only questions, only the knowledge that somewhere beneath that chapel floor, the girl who once danced through palace halls, who once smiled at a king and kissed a courtier, had vanished like ash in the wind. And yet, she was not entirely gone. Décades passed. Monarchs rose and fell. Wars were fought. Churches burned. And still the Tower of London stood, stone upon stone, keeping its secrets. And in the reign of Queen Victoria, the past was disturbed again. Work was ordered inside the chapel. The floor was lifted. Earth was turned. Bones were exhumed, examined, and, where possible, identified. Anne Boleyn was found small, elegant, cleanly decapitated by a French sword. Jane Boleyn was found beside her, her body twisted with time. Other names surfaced: Margaret Pole, Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell. But Katherine Howard, nothing. No femur, no skull, no fragments of the teeth that once smiled for a tyrant, no brittle ribcage to whisper her name. There were records, there were witnesses, there were reports of where she had fallen, and where she had been buried, but no physical trace. The lime had done its work. The king's will had prevailed. She had been removed, not just from the court, but from the earth itself. And yet, she was not silent. For even in her absence, her name stirred something in the stones. Her story refused to die. Visitors to the tower claimed they felt her presence, especially near the chapel. Some spoke of cold drafts. Though the air was still, some heard footsteps, soft and hurried, as if someone were fleeing too late. Others said they saw her, the shadow of a girl in white, gliding past the place where her body had once lain. Not angry, not vengeful, just searching. And it is perhaps fitting that a girl whose bones were taken from her still walks the halls, that a queen who was never truly crowned continues to haunt a kingdom that forgot her too quickly. She is the echo that will not fade, the perfume that lingers after the room is empty, the prayer whispered not to saints, but to girls who once believed in love. Henry VIII, in his rotting pride, believed he could erase her, that with lime and silence and a single perfect blow, he could bury the shame of having chosen wrong. He did not want a grave that others might visit. He did not want a ghost that others might pity. He wanted the girl gone, dissolved, forgotten. But even now, 500 years later, we remember her name. We remember that she was young. We remember that she smiled, and wept, and hoped, and failed. We remember that she was human. And that, perhaps, is the one thing Henry could never control. There is a small stone in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. It rests near the altar, beneath the flickering light of votive candles that tourists sometimes light without knowing why. Carved upon its surface is a name, Katherine Howard. Just the name. No dates, no epitaph. No truth carved in marble to say who she was, or how she died, or what she had once hoped to become. The stone is a memorial, but not a tomb, a gesture, a placeholder, because the truth is, no one knows where her body lies. No one ever did. The chapel, for all its quiet beauty, is a place built on forgetting. Beneath its worn stone floor are the remains of dozens, maybe hundreds of those who died under the blade. The noose, or the silence of royal will. There are saints and traitors buried side by side. Men who plotted rebellion, women who prayed for forgiveness, children who never reached adulthood. Time has turned them all into bones. But Katherine did not become bones. She became nothing. And yet, her story remained. It lingered in the air of the tower like a perfume that would not fade. It whispered through the corridors where she once walked, barefoot and shaking. The night before her death, it echoed in the minds of those who tried, centurer la terre, to unearth her. Not just her body, but her truth. But history, when told by kings, is rarely kind to the girls they killed. Henry VIII had wanted her erased. He did not want to remember the girl who had shamed him, who had smiled at another man, who had written words not meant for his eyes. And so, he buried her without ceremony. He destroyed her body with quicklime. He passed laws that made it legal to execute a woman declared mad. He silenced her with steel. And then he never spoke her name again. But he did not build her a tomb. He did not give her a place to rest. And that was a mistake. For in the absence of a tomb, something else grew. A myth. A sorrow. A memory so persistent, it outlived even the tower's thickest walls. They say that spirits do not cling to the living. They cling to the places where they were last seen, to the places where they were taken too soon. And Katherine, whose youth was swallowed by a king's pride and a court's cruelty, found herself trapped between legend and silence. Long after the executioner had cleaned his blade, long after the crowds had left the scaffold, people began to speak of her again. Not in court, not in council, but in whispers, in corners, in poems written by women who had also loved and lost, in lullabies sung by nurses who remembered the old names, in stories told by tower guards who claimed to have seen her on moonless nights, gliding through the chapel door without sound. Some said she wept. Others said she ran. But most agreed she never spoke, because there was no one left to listen. It is a strange thing, to be remembered without a resting place. Most queens are given tombs the size of chapels, their names engraved in Latin and gold. They are wrapped in silk, surrounded by saints, guarded by angels carved in stone. They are mourned in music and prayer, entombed in history and honor. But Katherine had only a memory, and that memory would not obey the king's wish to forget. In the Victorian era, when the tower's past was dug up and catalogued like bones in a museum, the search for her body turned desperate. Historians scoured records. Clerics inspected the chapel floor. Workers unearthed skeletons, measured skulls, compared wounds. Anne Boleyn was found, as was Jane Boleyn, and even Lady Margaret Pole. But Katherine's grave, if it ever existed, had long since dissolved into earth. The lime had done its work. Her youth had betrayed her again, bones not yet fully hardened, soft enough to vanish under time, and fire and command. Still, they tried. Still, they hoped, because somehow, it felt unbearable that she could have disappeared so completely. And perhaps that is the reason her story endured, not because she was the most beloved of queens, not because she was wise or noble or brave, but because she was so young, and so lost, and so thoroughly abandoned, because even after death, the world refused to give her peace, because she had no tomb, and so the living were forced to carry her. In time, her story shifted. No longer the guilty queen, no longer the foolish girl, but the victim, the one who was never taught how to survive the court, who was never given a chance to explain, who was punished for wanting to love, and condemned for failing to lie. Plays were written. Paintings imagined her last night, her long hair trailing down her back as she practiced laying her neck on the block. Novels gave her voice. Historians gave her context. Women gave her empathy. And still, the tower held its silence. The chapel never confessed. The king never repented. But Katherine remained. A queen without a grave. A girl without a mother. A ghost without a home. And in the quiet corners of the tower, where the candlelight flickers against ancient stone, some still say they feel her, not in anger, not in vengeance, but in sorrow, as if she is still waiting for someone to find her name etched properly into the earth, for someone to lift the weight of blame from her shoulders, for someone, finally, to answer. But no one does, because the truth is, England was never built to mourn its girls. The chapel of St. Peter at Vincula was never meant to carry so many dead. It was built for prayer, for hymns, for quiet reflection beneath a vaulted sky. But with each monarch, each execution, each grim procession across Tower Green, the chapel's floor swelled with secrets. The stones grew heavy with names that no longer had voices. The ground beneath packed tighter, with the remains of those who had once dined in palaces, ruled kingdoms, whispered betrayals, and wept alone. There are too many bones beneath those worn flagstones. Too many histories twisted together in a single shallow graveyard. And among them, so the records say, lies Katherine Howard, or what little the quicklime left of her. But what does it mean to lie in a place where no one is sure your bones remain? What does it mean to be remembered with a stone that marks a guess, not a grave, for centuries? The chapel sat in silence, its floor undisturbed, the bodies beneath untouched, the names above fading under candle, soot, and time. It was only when Queen Victoria ordered restorations in the 19th century that the earth was finally opened. The layers peeled back, and the royal archaeologists descended with gloves and ledgers, determined to match skulls with stories, to bring order to the chaos of Tudor blood. They found Anne Boleyn, her remains small and elegant, with clean cuts that confirmed the French executioner's sword. They found Jane Boleyn, still close by, her body contorted by time and madness. They found Margaret Pole, aged and broken, her bones showing the wild violence of an unskilled axe. And they found many others, men and women lost to royal wrath or forgotten trials. But Katherine was not among them. No skeleton could be matched to her. No young woman's frame. No familiar curve of skull or telltale injury. No trace of youth among the dust. The floor held too many bodies. Too many limbs overlapping. Too many anonymous spines crisscrossing the crypt. And in the chaos, Katherine was gone. Perhaps it was the lime. Perhaps it was her age. Her bones, still soft, still unfinished. might have dissolved more quickly than the rest. Perhaps the men who buried her did not bury her at all. Perhaps she was cast into some other pit, unnamed, unmarked, ordered away in the darkness before dawn. Or perhaps she is there still, and spread so finely across the soil that no one will ever separate her from the others. In death, she may have become part of all of them. The girl who dissolved into the very foundation of the place that destroyed her. But the question never rested. Historians returned to it. Again and again. Like hands drawn to a scar. Where is she? How could a Queen of England vanish so completely, in the age of paper and record, where every court expense and wedding gift and legal decree was written down and catalogued? How could the burial of a royal wife slip into shadow? The question echoed louder with each decade, gaining force, not just as an academic curiosity, but as a symbol of something larger, something more tragic. What does it mean to be erased? And who decides who is allowed to remain? For in the silence of the chapel, Catherine's disappearance began to feel less like an accident and more like a punishment. It was not just her life the king had taken. It was her afterlife. He had denied her not only justice, but rest. No priest read her name into the book of hours. No choir sang her into heaven. No child placed flowers on her grave, because there was no grave to place them on. And yet, the visitors still came. They walked the aisle of the chapel, pausing at the worn memorial stone with her name. They took photos. They whispered. They bent down as if to listen. They left tokens, flowers, letters, folded bits of paper with her name, scrawled gently in blue ink. Not because they knew her, not because they believed they would find her, but because they could not bear that she had been so thoroughly taken. The chapel grew heavy with memory. Even the stones seemed to hold breath. The organ played as always. The choir sang psalms. But in the quiet moments between services, her absence spoke louder than the music. And the question no one could answer, hung in the air like smoke from an old fire. Where is she? Where is the girl who died for a king's wounded pride? Where is the queen who was too young to understand how dangerous her smile had become? There are legends. Of course. One says her remains were scattered in secret by servants who loved her. Another claims she was buried outside the walls, like a criminal, far from the chapel's reach. Some believe she was never buried at all, that the lime did its work so completely that her body simply ceased to exist, leaving nothing behind but the memory of a scream that never came. But no tale has ever been proven. And the tower, as always, remains silent. Perhaps this is what it means to haunt, not to appear in mirrors or echo down stone halls, but to remain as a question no one can bear to stop asking. Perhaps Catherine's ghost is not a figure in white, but a single sentence carried through generations. Why was she never found? Why was she not allowed the peace even murderers were granted? The chapel, with its painted ceiling and worn pews, still holds too many bones. It has become a reliquary of regret, a vault for all the stories that ended too soon. And among those stories, Catherine's absence remains the most present. The chapel could bury her body, if it had it, but it cannot bury the question. The question keeps coming back. It walks alongside the tourists. It lingers in the corners where the light fades. It hums through the hymnals and settles in the silence after the final amen. And perhaps that is all the justice she will ever have. Not a tomb, not a monument, not a return, but a question that will not die. She was just a girl. That was all she ever was. Beneath the silks and the titles and the weight of a crown never truly placed upon her head. Just a girl with soft hands and quick laughter. A girl who had known loneliness long before she knew love. A girl who trusted the wrong words, wrote the wrong letter, kissed the wrong name into a folded scrap of paper, and passed it into the world as though the world were kind. She was not born for power, not trained in survival, not taught how quickly tenderness could become treason. But England made her a queen, and then unmade her with a blade. 5 centuries have passed since the axe fell. 5 centuries of war and peace, of new crowns, new dynastias, new reasons to forget the old. But Katherine Howard, the girl who died young, has never quite left. Her name lingers like dust on a windowsill, soft, quiet, not easily noticed, but never entirely gone. History tried to forget her, to push her into the shadows beside louder tragedies. Bloodier queens, more politically significant corpses. But there is something about the way she vanished. Something about the gentle horror of being erased so cleanly that England has never been able to look away. There is no tomb to kneel beside, no monument to photograph, no Latin inscription catching light in a cathedral dome. There is only a chapel floor and a memorial stone whose words feel more like apology than tribute. There is only a list of names, and somewhere between them, a question. Her bones were never found. The lime did its work. The silence did its work. The law that killed her did not leave room for remembering, but she remains, not in relics or relic rooms, not in gilded coffins, but in the uneasy breath of every visitor who stands near that stone and finds themselves unable to move away too quickly. She remains in the eyes of those who read her story and feel the chill of recognition, not because they are queens, but because they, too, were once girls who didn't know how dangerous it was to be chosen. They say she died with grace, that she practiced her death the night before, that she lowered her head again and again onto the wooden block, not out of hysteria, but with the quiet hope that she might meet the axe without fear. And maybe that was her last act of control to choose. If not how to live, then how to leave. To give the executioner no reason to hesitate. To ensure that if she must be forgotten, she would at least not be remembered for screaming. But she is not forgotten. She comes back every time a girl is blamed for being loved too early. Every time a woman's silence is mistaken for confession. Every time history repeats its cruelties with cleaner language and softer weapons, Katherine walks in those stories. Not as a ghost in white, but as a name that refuses to vanish. And in the quiet hours, when the candles burn low and the halls of the tower fall into sleep, one can almost imagine her there, walking barefoot across the stone. Her hands open, her face unreadable, no longer asking to be saved, only asking to be seen, not as a queen, not as a traitor, just as a girl. The England that killed her could not forget her, not because it tried to remember, but because the wound she left never fully closed. She was not Anne Boleyn, with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue. She was not Catherine of Aragon, heavy with royal dignity. She was not Jane Seymour, mother of a king. She was simply a child, caught, loved briefly, then condemned, buried under soil that never held her shape. But England felt her absence more than her presence, felt it every time it passed that chapel, every time it failed another girl, every time it let silence take the place of answers. History is not kind to the young. It rarely slows down long enough to let them speak. But tonight, as the world goes still and the tower darkens, let us imagine Catherine's voice, not screaming, not pleading, but telling her story the way it should have been told. Slowly, softly, without blame, without rush. Let us hear it not with judgment, but with the ache of knowing how close we have all come, at some point, to being devoured by something we didn't understand. Let her be, finally, more than a question. Let her be a girl who lived, a girl who laughed in borrowed gardens, a girl who wrote foolish letters in ink and hope, a girl who laid her head on a block and made the world hold its breath. Let her rest, not in a tomb of stone, but in a cradle of memory, kept not by kings, but by those who understand what it is to be forgotten and still refuse to disappear. And if, someday, her bones are found beneath some slab of earth or twist of chapel brick, and the dust of her fingers is uncovered, let the world receive her gently. Let them bury her not with silence, but with song. But if she is never found, then let her remain in the breath between sentences, in the hush before sleep, in the final exhale of a story told by candlelight, because some girls were never meant to be buried, only remembered.